Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen and fellow Nuffield scholars. Firstly, I want to say what a fantastic conference it has been. All of the presentations I've seen have firmly hit the remit of leading positive change in agriculture. Now, I'm the last speaker, so I'm not sure if that's the graveyard shift or the headline act, but you'll have to let me know at the end. Right. So, farming feels under attack. Perhaps it always has done, but now more than ever. Just this week, there has been a mass lobby in Westminster in response to changes made to inheritance tax relief on farmland. Farming now feels even closer to the precipice than it did when I began my Nuffield scholarship. But for me, that threat came from a different angle. For 10 years, I stood across the counter from our London meat customers, explaining the virtues of our high animal welfare standards and forage-based systems. Over that period, my customers shifted from asking me about animal welfare to being concerned about the environmental credentials of their purchases and what damage that might be causing. In the same 10 years, there's been one news story after another encouraging consumers to eat less red meat and save the planet. I set out with three objectives: to determine the state of play with UK red meat and its emissions, to investigate ways into which this might be mitigated, and to develop ways that this might be better communicated to a wider audience. I set out looking for technical solutions to what I considered to be a technical problem. Farming is, after all, a very technical business. If you aren't achieving growth rate X, apply input Y, and you will achieve result Z. So this seemed the rational way for me to approach the problem. I'd heard about this seaweed product in Australia that could be included in the diet of ruminants to reduce the amount of methane they emitted, and in my mind, it was just a case of including however many kilos of that product in my animal's ration, and hey presto, carbon neutral beef and lamb. Before the COVID travel restrictions were eased, I set out across the UK, meeting some genuinely world-leading farmers who were outstanding at the technical. Neil McGowan, over there, enlightened me on how making the correct genetic choices could have dramatic improvements both on financial and carbon balance sheets. Alex Brewster left my jaw agog when he showed me the difference in soil quality and grass growth rates that could be made when applying his regenerative principles. I visited the foremost plant breeding technicians in the UK, who showed me how newer grass varieties would transform my paddocks and help me get more from less. The technical solutions to improving the environmental credentials of red meat were right here on our doorstep. Incidentally, I now buy tups from Neil and grass seed from said seed merchant, but Alex Brewster, now it's winter, I guess I'll have to order one of your coats. I set off around Europe to discover how farmers in places where food was more ingrained in their culture were operating. In Italy, I met Luca on the left there, who was producing the most fantastic mozzarella and selling it at his on-farm restaurant. And he wasn't at all concerned about the rise in veganism. He was doing what he did well. His restaurant had one menu, which always included meat and cheese, and if you didn't like it, you politely asked to go and eat somewhere else. The restaurant was always full. But what struck me most about my time in Italy was just how connected each individual farmer was with their product, to the extent that I would almost describe it as an extension of their personality. That's something that we can really ponder here in the UK, where I know that I certainly am guilty of just loading that product onto a lorry and then forgetting about it. In Portugal, near the Spanish border, I met Alfredo, on the right here, who runs the Frejo de Mayo farm, an 800-hectare operation that employs over 30 people, serving local customers with meat, vegetables, fruit, bread, amongst a whole variety of other things, on a subscription basis. The business is fully cooperative, with both employees and customers having a stake. Alfredo, who is a disciple of Alan Savory, looks at his business holistically. He considers all of the environmental and social implications when making decisions, and all of the stakeholders were bought in. So, I arrived in Zimbabwe at Dimbangombe, try saying that after a few beers, chomping at the bit to visit the Savory Institute. This movement was being put on a pedestal as both walking the walk of showing improvements that ruminant livestock can make and talking the talk of how this can be communicated to a wider audience. And I wanted to see what I could take home and apply to the UK environment. Now, the ecological improvements being made here are astounding. It's a literal oasis in a part of Africa that sees very little rainfall, achieved through the mob grazing of cattle with long rest periods. Now, these are similar results to that I was seeing in the UK, but it doesn't rain in Zimbabwe like it does in Scotland. So to see that level of vegetative growth really impressed me. However, I must say I did leave feeling disappointed, as I didn't feel there was a clear enough link being drawn between these improvements and the involvement of the beef herd. It was almost as though the beef animals were passengers on their journey towards these ecological gains that weren't being marketed or prioritised as the result of doing the hard work. Pondering this, I then drove 2.5 hours in a beaten-up rental car down a dirt track to meet a man named Vianney on the left here, who had taken part in some of the workshops at the Africa Centre. This was the first of a couple of seminal meetings on my Nuffield journey. And the hairs on my arms still stand on end when I consider this meeting. Vianney had 1 hectare. Convention taught him to grow monoculture maize on that hectare, which resulted in boom and bust years for him and his family. Now, either they ate or they didn't. After receiving training in regenerative principles at Dimbangombe, Vianney had incorporated both pigs and chickens in mobile housing into his rotation to build soil fertility, and he was growing a variety of crops to protect against any single crop failure. Now, it's a bit cliched, but this was my light bulb moment. I realised that whilst farming, yes, is a very technical business, it is even more a business of people and relationships. It's all very good having all of the technical answers, and we're on the road to doing this. But if the relationships aren't nurtured that allow this information to be transferred, both between farmers and then onto the consumer, then our time is wasted. Rather embarrassingly, the realization that farming is a people business that solves technical problems rather than a technical business that employs people was a complete paradigm shift for me. Not long after returning from Africa, I suffered personal bereavement. My mother, who had been incredibly proud of my having a Nuffield scholarship, passed away very suddenly. She had been a strong advocate for farming networks through her own work, serving as a confidant, friend, and business advisor for many of her farming clients. And having a complete change of perspective in Africa, my Nuffield journey now became intensely personal. With this in mind, I visited California looking through a completely different lens. I saw only opportunity for developing relationships that could benefit both individual businesses and the industry more widely. Tomcat Ranch, just south of San Francisco, is a not-for-profit farm focused on educating the masses about food production that has reversed the commonly thought farm-to-fork mantra. Their concept of fork to farm sets out to influence the eating habits of consumers and the procurement decisions of large organisations by showcasing their regenerative practices to, say, for example, healthcare professionals, so that they would then procure their food from regenerative sources. They also offer training in regenerative principles to farmers and ranchers so that they can adopt them and thus balance the supply and demand curve. Further north, I met Jamie and Robert Irwin on the left here. They've been cultivating relationships with both vineyards and homeowner organisations for many years, providing a grazing service that eradicates weeds between the vines and reduces the amount of fuel for the ever-increasing risk of wildfire. Now, Robert said something to me that struck home. He said, "I think life is about relationships, not with just people, but with the land and with the animals. If you build positive relationships and everyone works together, the only thing that can happen is positive." In the northernmost part of California, farm Jill Hackett and her family. Another seminal meeting for me. When I met Jill's son, Connor, it verged on the eerie at times, how someone on the other side of the world could be having exactly the same thoughts on things as me. Connor had left a job in consultancy to move home and start a family with his wife Katie on the ranch, and we hit it off instantly, sharing identical thoughts on how we could nurture relationships in the local farming community and create a much stronger inclusive body. Connor has gone on to start a local meat brand that supports many of these local farmers, and it made me think, what can I do once I've finished? So, having travelled, searching for answers, what had I learned? Nuffield has given me the fantastic opportunity to look outwardly, to see different perspectives and challenge existing paradigms. But largely, the answers I found lay inwardly, in local communities and networks. In Italy, Luca had shown me the importance of having a relationship with your product. In Portugal, Alfredo has shown me that cooperation truly can work. And in Zimbabwe, it was Vianney that showed me that network can completely change your life, from not having food to feed your family to having a surplus. Now, we all need a big why. And for me, the most important why one can have is supporting family and community, because they're the rocks upon which you rely when things get tough. The answer to the future of the red meat sector is the leverage of our most valuable asset, these networks and relationships and the willingness we have to help each other. A much more cooperative industry that shares more readily creates champions that can represent us both on social media and in speaking to the mainstream press, so that we can have more control over the narrative of our story. And I challenge everyone here to look out across this room, a room full of the best and brightest minds in our industry. It is said that a rising tide lifts all ships. Be the tide, and let those in your community be the ships that you lift. My thanks must go to my sponsor, the Worshipful Company of Butchers, in particular Bob Bansbach, my fellow 2021 cohort who've all been fantastic, and my family, in particular my wife, who's over there 8 months pregnant and has done more than her fair share of parenting in my absence. Thank you very much.